Facts, Part 144. In 1978, 15-year-old Mary Vincent was hitchhiking in California when she was picked up by 56-year-old Larry Singleton. The man eventually knocked her out with a sledgehammer and sexually assaulted her that night. The next day, he cut off both her arms with a hatchet and threw her into a ditch to die. But Mary managed to pack her stumps with blood to stop the bleeding and spent all night crawling out. She eventually made it to the highway and started walking, naked and covered in blood. The first car that saw her sped away in horror. The second car was a couple on their honeymoon who picked her up and she survived. Singleton was sentenced to 14 years in prison but was released 6 years early due to good behavior. He would go on to murder a different woman named Roxanne Hayes a few years later. These morbid facts might make you think twice about visiting a zoo. The 1889 World's Fair in Paris was where the Eiffel Tower was officially unveiled. That same fair also had a Negro zoo with 400 black people in cages as one of the attractions. Most white tigers in zoos are white because of forced inbreeding, and they're almost always born with genetic birth defects. A chimpanzee named Santino collected stones and stockpiled them to throw at passing visitors. This was the first ever observed case of an animal planning a premeditated attack. In 1993, a military jet flew over a zoo in Sweden and caused great stress to the animals. 23 baby animals were eaten by their parents as a protective response. There's a condition called zoochosis that causes repeated pacing, vomiting, and even self-mutilation. These behaviors are not seen anywhere in the wild and are only displayed because of captivity. Here are some morbid facts that you didn't know about the JFK assassination. A few weeks before JFK was killed, 2 military code operators intercepted messages about a planned assassination attempt. But instead of being taken seriously, the 2 men were admitted to mental asylums. Lee Harvey Oswald's widow is still living in Texas today and still believes that her husband was innocent. JFK's brain has been missing from the National Archives for more than 50 years. The car in which JFK was assassinated was cleaned up and repurposed back into rotation. It served as the presidential limo for Johnson, Nixon, Ford, and Carter following JFK's death. After the president was assassinated, his wife Jackie refused to remove the blood-stained pink suit she wore that day. She even wore it when LBJ was sworn in as president, saying, quote, "I want them to see what they've done to Jack." Here are some morbid facts that you didn't know about the American Civil War. During the Civil War, twice as many soldiers died from diseases than battle injuries. Dysentery and chronic diarrhea were so prevalent that there was an honor code among soldiers to never shoot a man while he's pooping. This is a photo comparison of Abraham Lincoln before and after the war. Many Cherokee Indians sided and fought with the Confederacy during the Civil War. This was because many of them were black slave owners themselves and they still resented the Union for the Trail of Tears. Confederate soldier W.V. Meadows was shot in the eye during the Battle of Vicksburg. He survived and 58 years later he coughed the bullet out of his mouth. Until the Civil War, Robert E. Lee owned a plantation across the river from Washington, D.C. Once the Union Army captured the land, they started burying Union soldiers there to spite Lee. Today that property is known as Arlington Cemetery. Morbid Facts, Part 146. When Tatanisha Hedman discovered that her husband molested their daughter, she took matters into her own hands and set him on fire. The 40-year-old mother waited for her husband to fall asleep before pouring kerosene on him and lighting a match. She later admitted to police that she intentionally set him on fire because shooting him would have been too nice. There's a Mickey Mouse comic strip from 1930 in which Minnie leaves him for another mouse. In response, Mickey then attempts several ways to commit suicide. In 1966, former U.S. Marine Charles Whitman suddenly went crazy and killed 16 people, including his mother and wife. Prior to the shooting, Whitman had seen several doctors due to the sudden onset of irrational thoughts. After his death, an autopsy concluded that a brain tumor was pressing against his amygdala, likely contributing to his sudden horrific behavior. Morbid facts that you didn't know about the atomic bombing of Hiroshima, Part 2. Godzilla was originally created to symbolize the atomic bombings and a victim of them. He's covered in keloid scars to depict the brutal body scars of survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Survivors who suffered the most from the bombings were in such horrific condition that people called them ant-walking alligators. They were described to be faceless, with their heads transformed into blackened alligator hides, with red holes indicating mouths. Just months after the bombings, Kix Cereal offered an atomic bomb-shaped ring in exchange for a box top and 15 cents. While the atomic bombings were devastating, the most destructive bombing raid in world history actually took place a few months earlier. The US Army used incendiary bombs to light a giant flaming X over the center of Tokyo. It left at least 100,000 civilians dead and 1 million more homeless. Morbid Facts, Part 145. In 1903, Topsy the elephant was executed by poisoning, strangulation, and electrocution. A 74-second video of the electrocution was recorded and preserved by Thomas Edison. It may have been the first time ever that death was captured in a motion picture film. In 1854, a 13-year-old boy died in San Francisco after a circus clown swung him around by the heels. A Frenchman named Tarare was famous in the 1700s for his endless appetite. He was reported to have eaten live snakes, cats, lizards, and puppies. In one case, he ate a meal intended for 15 people in a single sitting. While being treated in a hospital for his condition, he was caught trying to drink other patients' blood and eat corpses from the morgue. After being suspected of eating a toddler, he was ejected from the hospital. Morbid Facts, Part 147. In 1991, Patricia Stallings was sentenced to life in prison for poisoning her child with antifreeze. She then gave birth to a second child while in prison, who was given to a foster care. But he eventually became sick with the same symptoms as the first child, indicating a rare metabolic disorder, not poisoning. This proved her innocence and she was later released. In a Mexican prison in 2020, two rival drug cartels decided to have a friendly soccer match. Things must have gotten out of hand pretty quickly since the match ended with 16 people dead. In 1975, it was revealed that the CIA had developed a heart attack gun that fired a dart of frozen water and shellfish toxin. Once inside the body, it would melt, leaving only a small red mark on the victim. The official cause of death would always be a heart attack.